Now, who remembers what we are talking about over the summer? Parables. All right, row D has been paying attention. That's why high achievers up here, front row. I guess that's the front row. Maybe second row. We are speaking about parables for the summer. These teachings of Jesus. I love parables. They are deep, profound, mysterious, confusing, challenging, all at the same time. You read them once, you take something away from it. You read it a second time, you take something else away from it. You come back to it 5 years later, you see it from a completely new perspective. The thing about parables, and I would say the thing about the Bible, is the wisdom and depth contained within is never ending. You read something, then 10 years later you come back and you're like, oh my goodness, I hadn't seen that before. Because see, you have changed, so you're reading, it's the same material, the same words, but you've changed as a person because you're not the same person today that you were 10 years ago. Now today, the parable that I want to speak on is a parable that I spoke on 10 years ago. I looked back at my old sermon. It was all right. It was good. But I said, I think I can do better than that. That's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to try to top the parable from 10 years ago. Or at least look at it from a little different angle. Because honestly, I look at all these sermons and from years past, I love them. Because it shows for me a journey that I've been on. And it's so interesting to look back on earlier ways in which you looked at things. You see where you were at the time. Then you look at where you are now and you see how much you've grown, how much you've changed. And I love being able to look back at, which is what we're doing over the summer for the most part, looking back at sermons I gave on parables many, many years ago, and now looking at them, hopefully, I don't know if I want to say deeper, but from a whole fresh new perspective. Now, this one is titled, Don't Forget the Oil. And this is based on, it's known as the parable of the 10 virgins. And let's start with the setting of this parable. The setting is the final week of Jesus' life. Jesus knows where his life is heading. He has completed his 3 years of ministry. He is now on his way to Jerusalem. He's on his way to the cross. And what happens in this parable that we will read in Matthew chapter 25 is Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem. He's overlooking the city of God. Here's a picture of what it would look like. This is obviously, there's modern buildings in the background. Those would not have been there at the time of Jesus, just a quick disclaimer. But from the Mount of Olives, you can see the old city of Jerusalem. And this is where Jesus is sitting, where he's resting. He's gathering himself before all these events that are about to happen. Again, Jesus knows what is about to go down. He knows he is walking to his death. So he's taking a breather for a moment, overlooking the city that he loves, the city of God, this holy city that the Israelites have loved for many, many years. And what happens here is the disciples approach Jesus, and they privately ask him a question. This is important because Jesus is not speaking to the crowds in this parable. He is speaking to his disciples who have been walking with him intimately for 3 years. They approach him with a question that they have been wondering probably for quite a while, a question that they don't want to ask in front of other people, but a question that they're okay asking just in their little small group. And they ask Jesus, they say, when will we know that it's the end of the age? When will the end come? When will the kingdom of God come to this world? Because what the disciples were looking forward to was the restoration of all things. For God coming and to put everything back the way in which it was intended to be. The disciples were longing for evil to be eradicated, for sin to be removed from the world. What they were longing for is for the Romans, who were those in power in Jerusalem, to be removed from power so that Israel, the true people of God, could once again be in their glory. This is what the disciples were longing for. And Jesus, instead of giving them a direct answer, offers them a bunch of truths and then some parables as a way to give an answer. Isn't that really interesting about Jesus? He can give direct answers, and he does from time to time, but most of the time when Jesus is asked a question, he responds with a story. He gives them almost, I want to say, like a riddle. Here, you guys go and now sift through this. You go and figure this out. So here's one of the parables that Jesus offers in response to this question. And this is in Matthew 25, verse 1. At that time, speaking about the end of the age, at that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. They reclined their seats. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." Sounds harsh. But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." All right. Now, in order to understand this parable, we have to first talk about first century Jewish weddings. Because first century Jewish weddings, they looked a bit different than 21st century Western wedding ceremonies. Things, they moved along quite differently than they do today in our world. There were different stages within a first century Jewish wedding. First, you have the betrothal period. Now, the way in which this worked, if there was a young man who happened to spot a fair maiden in a village somewhere, and she captured his attention, he would go to his father and he would say, "Sally over there, she's mighty fine. I would like her to be my wife." So together they would go and they would approach this fair maiden's family. The parents would work out some sort of a contract. If this maiden liked what she saw, then they would move forward with things. And there would be a binding legal contract at this point in time that this young man and this maiden were to be married. There would be some sort of a transaction possibly, and then there would be some signing of things. Then, after this contract was sealed, the young man would return back to his village, to his home, for an undetermined amount of time. He would go back to live with his family in order to prepare a room or a house for his soon-to-be bride, leaving this young lady to continue living with her family until eventually he shall return for her. Now, during this time, typically it would have been about a year that this happened. So there is this betrothal, there's this legal contract, and then for about a year, they would have been separated. There would have been really no contact. This bride-to-be would have worn a veil over her face in order to signify that she was taken, that whoever this man from another village might be, she was pledged to him. So for however long that might be that she was waiting for her soon-to-be husband, she would be wearing a veil to let other potential suitors know that she was off limits. And the majority of her time during this period of waiting would have been spent with other maidens, with other virgins, others who either are pledged to be married or who are not married at this point. She would have had her little posse of maidens, and they would have gone to the spa, they would have gone to get coffee, they would have whatever you do in the first century with all of your female friends, they would have gone and done that together, while she also would have let others know, don't touch, because I have been spoken for. Now, after the betrothal, you have the waiting period that we described a little bit. The groom went, and this also is in reference to some of the other passages, so maybe you might be familiar with other passages that Jesus talks about, saying, I am going to prepare a room. Jesus is talking about first century wedding customs. The groom would have lived with his parents still in his father's house. He would have built this room. He would have built a house so that eventually when he goes to gather his bride and brings her back, there would have been a home waiting for her. Now, no one could determine when this room was ready except the groom's father. So the groom's father would have been inspecting his son's work. If you're a father, if you've had a father, we've all had fathers. Sometimes you know how that can go. Little more detail over here, son. Put a little more effort into this portion of the room. It was only once the father deemed the room was ready that the groom could go and collect his bride. No one knew how long this construction would go on for. Even the groom had no idea how long the construction would go on for. It was only the father who could determine when this home was ready for his son and his wife to live in. Now, after the father had said, all right, we're good to go, everything is all set, you finally come to the wedding ceremony. There would have been no save the dates, like a year, 2 years, 5 years in advance. None of those would have been sent in the mail. There's no invitation. Will you kindly respond to this? Will you attend or will you not attend? How many guests will you be bringing? None of this, because again, no one knew exactly when the ceremony would take place except the father. Once he says, we got the clear, everything is good, we're ready to go, then the groom would take his groomsmen. He would gather his friends. This is kind of like an ancient bachelor party, because together this group would then, full of joy, very loud, boisterous, they would travel together to wherever this fair maiden lived, most likely in another village. So they had a bit of a journey that they would have to take. They would travel together in order to collect this groom's bride. Imagine the joy in this procession. You have been working for maybe a year, preparing for this particular moment, it has finally arrived. You get all your closest friends and you say, hey, I am going to get Sally and bring her back here now. It's time for a party. It's time for us to finally we've had this contract. We've legally, in a sense, been married for a while, but now it's finally going to be fulfilled. The moment I have been waiting for, the moment she's been waiting for, hopefully, it will all go down now. So they would travel out to the village, and what they would do, let's say they came to the village and it was only 4 o'clock. They would wait, because the groom would enter the maiden's village at night. They would wait until about midnight. Then, some of you go to bed early, you're like, what? You're like, a 5 o'clock wedding is too late for me. Can we do noon? They would enter the village with a shout. They would call the bride's name, and they would say, we are ready. It's time to go on your journey. It's time to leave your father's house in order to come live with this groom, his family, in their house. Now, if you are this bride-to-be, and if you are her maidens, her friends, you have to always be prepared. Because this moment, you didn't know when it would happen. It was unexpected. So you had to always live prepared that this night could be the night that he is going to come and bring me to his home. You had to live every day, every moment, as if you were ready for your wedding ceremony. Now, women, I know you're like, whoa, I gotta get my nails done, my hair done. Like, how could I possibly live every moment as if this was my wedding day? How did that work? I don't know. I wasn't there. Not sure. Can we round up the photographer in time for this? Bonus check. Then what would happen is, once they entered the village, once they called the bride's name, everyone, the maiden and her friends, would then take the journey back to the groom's village, middle of the night. Everyone, this entire wedding party, the entire procession would travel from one home, from one village to another home. And when they got into the village, 2 things could have happened. One, every single person, including the bride-to-be, would go to the groom's house and then wait for him to return, because he would be cheering all around the village, letting all of his neighbors know, hey, today's the day, I'm getting married, we're having a ceremony, everyone come out to this party, we're going to celebrate my wedding day. Or another thing that might have happened is everyone except the bride would have gone to the groom's home, because the groom wanted to parade his wife around the village before the wedding. Either way, these 10 virgins, these 10 maidens, they head to the groom's home waiting for him to return, because once he returns to his home, then the ceremony can begin. This is what's going on here in this parable. So when Jesus talks about the end of the age, the coming of God's kingdom, the coming of God's rule, God's reign on this earth, he is likening it to a first century Jewish wedding. There's this promise. Think about the betrothal. There's a promise. I will come for you. We have this legal contract. I have chosen you. You will be my bride. I will return for you after I prepare a home. So what Jesus is saying is, there is this promise that is set in place. I will restore. I will heal. I will bring you home. I have chosen you. I've loved you. There's this promise in place. But then there's this waiting period. And see, sometimes we hear about God's love. We hear about this promise of God restoring, putting things back the way in which they're intended to be. There's a lot of brokenness in the world. So this question, when shall God's kingdom break into this world? Sometimes it feels like it's really, really far off in the distance. Or sometimes it feels as if it will never happen. And we question, we wonder when. We long for that moment. After Jesus ascended to heaven, the disciples, they started asking, well, when will Christ return? When will Christ return to rule over, to restore, to bring love and peace to this world? It's a question that Christians have been asking for 2,000 years. And so for us living in this waiting period where we live in a world of brokenness, but we live with this promise that all shall be restored, sometimes it's really difficult to live in that period of waiting. And it can feel as if this promise shall never come to fruition. So we have this waiting, but then eventually we have this party. We have this celebration. And so Jesus is saying, if you want to know what the end of the age will look like, well, it's going to look like a wedding ceremony. There's a promise in place, but yet then there's this indefinite period of waiting. And eventually we'll get to the party, but no one knows exactly when the party will be in full swing. No one knows exactly when the end shall come. And trying to determine when the end will come doesn't really help anyone because no one could possibly know. There's no definitive date, and people for many years have been trying to put dates on the return of Jesus, and those dates have come and gone because we're all still here today. So trying to put a date on it, that's why I think Jesus answers with a parable. He's like, you're never going to figure the whole thing out. But I promise you, the party shall be in full swing at some date in the future. Now, a couple of notes for us on this parable. First, the coming of God's kingdom, it is rooted in joy and love. This is a common theme that we have found throughout the parables. The coming of God's kingdom, it's rooted in love for creation, for humanity. It's rooted in love for all of us. Think about a wedding. What is the foundation of a wedding ceremony? Love, joy, commitment. So when Jesus likens the coming of God's kingdom to a wedding, Jesus is talking about the faithfulness of God to you, to this creation, to this world. Sometimes it can feel as if we've been abandoned by God. And in that period of waiting, it feels like that. So when Jesus says, well, the end is going to be like a wedding. And even today, you get engaged, then you have to wait for the wedding ceremony. So there always is this kind of waiting period there. But what Jesus is communicating, what he's saying to his disciples is, God will never give up on you. God will always remain in love, faithful to his promise of restoring you. Even if it doesn't feel that way at certain times, a promise that God shall be faithful. This parable also talks about God's provision for us. Think about the groom. What is he doing when he returns back to his village? He's preparing to provide for his bride, for their family, for their future together. what Jesus is saying in this parable is God will provide for you. God will provide what you need. God will not just leave you on the side of the road, but God will provide and be faithful to his promise that God has made to you. Second note, we read in the parable, the bridegroom was a long time in coming. As we mentioned, waiting is part of the process. You know what this tells me? In the waiting, feelings of God's absence are normal. Have you ever felt the absence of God? I'll tell you right now, that is normal. There's nothing wrong with you. There is nothing wrong with your faith. The feeling of God's absence, as if God has left the building, is a normal part of faith. This is why you can have in one moment feelings of great hope. And then a few moments later, you could be filled with great despair. Because hope and despair are part of waiting. This is why at one moment, you could feel a deep sense of loneliness. And then a short while later, you can feel a deep sense of connection. You have moments of love, and then there's moments of apathy. In the waiting process, there's moments of, will the moment ever arrive, and questioning if that will ever actually happen? And then you have moments of anticipation and excitement. The waiting period, God's absence, and then feeling God's presence and going back and forth, and sometimes one particular season can last for a while, and then you have another season that's really short, and you go back to possibly a feeling of God's absence again. It's all part of the faith journey. Then here's another note. At the time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps, went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, 5 were wise. This parable speaks about wise versus foolish ways of living, which is a common theme that we find all throughout Scripture. You see wise and foolish ways of living all the way back in the Old Testament. Jesus speaks about what it means to be wise and what it means to be foolish. In the parable we read, then all the virgins woke up as the bridegroom's calling out. They trimmed their lamps. The foolish one said to the wise, give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out. No, they replied, there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves. Found an artist's rendering of this scene right here. See the maidens on the left-hand side. They are pleading, begging. We didn't bring any oil with us. Can we please have some of yours? And then the 5 who had brought extra oil, they're kind of turning their backs a bit. They're saying, no, we're sorry. You need to go buy your own oil. You know what this tells me? Here's what I think this parable is communicating in this scene. No one can walk your journey. You are responsible for your own spiritual health. You can't take someone else's oil. We all need our own oil. You can't depend on the faith of a parent, of a spouse, a pastor, a spiritual leader. In this parable, Jesus is placing responsibility in the hands of each individual. You, and only you, can walk your journey. This is why the maidens say to the other 5, we're sorry, but you need to provide your own oil. You need to live your life in a way where there is something sustainable within you. We are each responsible for our own spiritual health. You can't steal that from another person. And no one can freely offer that to you as well. Others can help you on your journey. And yes, of course, that's why we have church. That's why we meet together as a community, so that we can help provide some oil for others, but ultimately we are responsible for ourselves. Those who were wise, they lived the present. They lived the now in the reality of God's kingdom. They took part in creating a world of forgiveness, of love, grace, mercy, justice, all the attributes of God's kingdom. What it looks like for God's rule to break into this world. The wise live their lives in alignment with that way of being. But the foolish are those who put off living in the reality of the kingdom. The foolish are those who say, I'll deal with my unforgiveness somewhere down the road. I'll deal with my bitterness when it gets really, really bad. I know it's there. I know I have it, but I'll deal with it when it becomes debilitating. I'll deal with it when it really rears its ugly head. The foolish are those who say, I'll deal with my jealousy and my discontentment somewhere down the line. I'm going to put it off for a while. Or the lack of love that you feel within you for others or for the world or for yourself. The foolish are those who say, it's not that bad. It could be worse. They look at others and say, well, I'm not as bad as that person over there. This parable is saying the wise are those who bolster their spiritual health now, in this moment. They take steps to live their lives in a way that aligns with God's rule, while the foolish say, I'll worry about that sometime later. But what this parable is saying is that the longer you live entrenched in a way of being, the harder it becomes to change. This is a dire warning. This is not an easy parable. This is not a comfortable parable. For the wise, the longer you live in a way of love, the easier it becomes to continue walking in that direction. But for those of us who live our lives filled with jealousy, with bitterness, with hatred within, the easier it becomes to continue walking that road and to then change that way of being. We all become entrenched in the ways in which we live our lives. And this parable serves as a warning. Don't put off living a particular way. Don't put off until tomorrow or the next day a change that you can make in your life right now, today. See, Jesus would often talk about how the kingdom was a present reality. People would always ask him, when will the end come? What will it look like? Here's Luke chapter 17. Once, on being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, similar question, Jesus replied, the coming of the kingdom, it's not something that can be observed, nor will people say, hey, here it is, it's right here, or hey, whoa, there it is, over there, because the kingdom of God, it's within you. It's in your midst. It's right here. How you live now matters. You, Jesus says, in this parable, in this passage in Luke, to all those who are asking, when will the end come? When will things be fulfilled and restored? Jesus is saying, here's the truth. You can experience the reality of God's kingdom now, today, in your lives. It's not just for another time and place. And see, you'll have some people that will talk all about, well, when we get to heaven, well, then everything will be put back together. Everything will be okay. And sure, yes, that's fine, but you're missing out on the life that you can have here and now. What Jesus is communicating is that today, right now, you can have peace within. Jesus is saying, you can live your life with joy. You don't have to wait for it. You can have joy right here, right now. Jesus is saying, you can find healing for your brokenness. You don't have to wait for that. Healing is possible now. Jesus is saying, you can live your life with purpose. You're here for a reason. There is a purpose to your life. Something, a God-given gift that you have within you to offer the world. You don't have to wait for it. Like the Pharisees, the disciples, they were asking Jesus, when is a future way of living possible? And how does Jesus answer? Well, you don't know when the end of the age will come. Don't try figuring that out, but you can live your life right now, today, in a way that aligns with God's reign. So for today, there is this invitation. It's an invitation to trust in God's faithfulness to you and to this creation. To trust that God's peace and joy and forgiveness and healing is possible for you in your life now. And as the promise of Jesus is, as you live in that truth, you will experience the life you're looking for. It's a life that isn't for another time in another place, but it's a life that is in your midst, that's within you, that's available here and now. So the invitation of this parable that we've been reading, that we've been passing along, that we've been being challenged by for 2,000 years, it's a question. What is one decision or one action that you've been putting off? I'll deal with that later. I'll put this off until it gets really, really bad, and then I'll find some help for it. What have you been putting off? And it's stealing the life that God desires for you. What action, what decision have you been kicking down the road? And today is the day to act. Today is the day to get the help that you need. To begin moving in a new direction. This parable is an urgent warning. Don't put off until tomorrow what you can deal with today. Don't think that the life that God has for you is somewhere down the road, because the forgiveness, healing, love, and joy of Christ, it's available for you here and now. So take your oil. Build your life on a solid foundation, the foundation of God's kingdom. And as you do so, you will experience all the fullness and abundance of life that Christ promises for you, and that is available right here, today.